Go live now. Hello, everyone. You're very welcome to the Work From Anywhere series. Again, today we've got Nadia Harris and we've got Peter from WorkMotion that are joining us today. I'd like to say a big welcome to Peter Mandan and to Nadia Harris. Well, first of all, would you guys like to introduce yourselves today, and then I'll go into today's topic, I guess. Maybe Peter, you kick us off.
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody. So my name is Peter Manda. I'm Dutch. That's why there's this funny I in the Peter, but it's regular Peter. So I'm a tax lawyer. I've been working at PwC for a very long time, both in the Netherlands and then later on in Germany. Always been specializing around basically employee mobility. And then when remote work became relevant, then I started specializing on remote work and the employer compliance topics around this. In that process, I was building a partnership with WorkMotion. That was 2 years ago, more or less, basically when WorkMotion was founded. And that partnership escalated quickly. Basically, I joined WorkMotion, where I'm now the head of trust and employer compliance. And real short on WorkMotion, we're an employer of record, like remote, like deal. But there's a little bit more to the things that we do, but we'll get to that later.
Great. Okay, perfect. I should say as well, by the way, Lee McIvor Martin from Time Doctor, he was unable to make it, but he will get him on again another time, hopefully. But in the meantime, Nadia, would you guys give a bit of introduction to yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Nadia Harris, and as you can see below, I have founded remoteworkadvocate.com. I call it a place for companies and individuals to get to know, to thrive in the era of remote flexible working. What does it mean? It means that I work with companies that are ready to scale flexible working, remote working, hybrid working, working from anywhere. We'll discuss all these topics today for sure, as part of their business model. It's not just a perk. It's not just a matter of I allow you to do so, but it's really part of a business strategy. And everything that comes with it. So here we have processes, procedures. I'm also a lawyer as well. So not into tax as much as you guys, but definitely when it comes to employment laws, and I work with companies also helping them to craft short-term working abroad policies, all these things, but also from a perspective, from an operational perspective, how to be more efficient, more productive, tools, how to use the tools wisely, how to create a scalable infrastructure, all these things. And for individuals, well, recently, because of being out there, I get so many questions on a daily basis. How can I find a remote job? How can I do this? How can I do that? So also my website is a resource for people to change their lives and not just look for a job, but something that really matches their lifestyle, because I deeply believe that the future of work is people-centric. Thank you.
I like it. I mean, two great experts getting aboard. I would say as well, just to flag to everyone, there was a really good show yesterday, the McIvor show. They discuss a lot of the employers of record as well. Well, we're taking a look at that if you get a chance. I'd also like to say a big welcome as well to Melda Keane. She joined us this week. She's the former head of global mobility in Happen. I'm delighted to have her on board. This is our second week now at the moment. We've gained a lot from having her on board. And I would like to say a big hi to all the rest of the community. I'm seeing obviously Tyler Selhorn, from Polygon, and obviously we've got Roberto Vasquez and many others as well. You're all welcome. Feel free to mention the comments down below where in the world you're dialing in from. Today's topic, and please feel free, or those of you in the audience, to jump in with this as well, the business case for a borderless company. We're going to be going into that. And I mean, I would like to kind of talk to you all, the both of you on this to get your take. The business case for a borderless company, is it something that is something realistic, or is it just a pipe dream? Tell us more your take on that. Maybe Peter, you kick us off.
Yeah, sure. I think there's always a business case for work from anywhere, and why? Because we as lawyers, we can focus easy on the downsides of this, of let's say the cost of this business case. But maybe that's not so relevant in this regard, because I think especially the upside of this is basically overwhelmingly big. Makes it more or less even a no-brainer, unless you have something, let's say, non-financial against it. The world has now changed so strongly that you can always make a business case for this if you want to. The rest, I think you can figure out. So don't even need to spend a lot of time on this. Yes, there is a business case simply because there's such a great benefit. Everybody's getting used to working from wherever. And if you want to be an attractive employer, I think you really don't have a choice anymore.
Well, that's fascinating. I suppose we are seeing it as well with a lot of companies, even GitLab, I mean, them doing an IPO, and in many ways, a lot of different companies doing IPOs, but not even having a head office in lots of ways. So I think that's fascinating to see that aspect of it. I've seen you as well, Nadia, and we'll be asking you both of this as well. But what's your take, Nadia, on the business case for borderless companies? Are you working with a lot of different types of borderless companies? What are you seeing, pros and cons? What is the business case for becoming a borderless company?
So I'll play the devil's advocate because I travel nonstop and I am the one who's 100% remote and independent. But not everyone wants to do that, and I think we have a very big misunderstanding, which is what I see when I work with different companies about being borderless and working from anywhere, because that can mean many different things, especially when we look at those companies' announcements. It may mean that you work with an employer of record in 15 or 25 countries and people are hired everywhere, which is kind of borderless because you give them the opportunity. It may be that you have temporary work abroad policies that people can travel for a few months and be everywhere. So you're borderless too, in a way. Or you may have a situation that really people can be everywhere and move all the time. But again, from a legal perspective, all of us here know that it's not just sugar-coated just like that and 100% possible. But I think that my observation is that companies are definitely starting to see that this adds value. What worries me a bit is the fact that it's rather a result of the pressure that comes from the people that we want to do this because big companies have announced it. So they're like, oh, we will do it too, rather than understanding from my perspective that it actually should be the number one, at least company perk, if not part of a business strategy, rather than investing in mental health coaches and, all these kind of things that are very important too, but that is equally important because it allows people to really design their personal and professional lifestyle the way they really need it. And we are all different. And it's also about creating a diverse company these days, isn't it?
Well, it is. And I mean, let's just try and dive into that. Creating the business case for whatever company you want, be it borderless or not borderless or in one location. I think a lot of it does start with the data, doesn't it? I mean, where do you need to start with? One of the things, for example, let's put one statistic out there. Spotify, they had a 15% reduction in attrition after they announced their work from anywhere policy. But I've no doubt some companies tried it and it didn't work out for them, possibly. But I'm assuming in a lot of cases that has been the case, at least the ones that we've spoken to. But can you tell us more of building that business case? Where would you even start? I mean, I guess you'd start with where people want to work. How do you start collecting that data and kind of being able to build that business case? Who wants to take that one?
Whoever, I think we both will. So
go for it.
Okay, all right. So there are definitely a few elements. So the first one is the one that is happening right now. So it's the operational aspect. So as you've said, yes, ask your people, take a look at it, look at the competition as well, look at your place in the market today. And that's the data that you collect internally with your team. That's number one. Number two, look at the talent pools that you need. And I think that's the number one case these days, that companies start looking at the talent pool. So obviously we do see the global recession as well, but still some roles are still quite difficult to find and people have more flexibility. So as a company, you may say, oh, I want to hire people only in this certain location. But what happens is, well, you won't find them there because they're all working remotely. I was recently invited. I was in Frankfurt 2 weeks ago, and I had a conversation with MBA alumni, and there were heads of different departments, different companies, and they told me, well, we have a problem to find people locally. Why? We are paying the money. What's wrong? What's wrong? And I'm like, I'm going to tell you where the people are. Show me the roles. And I showed them, and they were absolutely amazed. They said, how is that possible? And they're like, oh, Nadia, why do people want to live in Vietnam if they can live in Germany? And I said, well, they don't really want to wait the whole year to have a break and to be able to go there and work from a different destination. So it's internally what the people are asking for. What you have to do is also not just treating it as a perk, as I've said, but definitely looking at the productivity metrics today. How do you even measure productivity? Unfortunately, in most businesses, it's I see you, you're there, which has nothing to do with being productive and working and delivering results. So I'd say first set this up to know the expectations from the manager's perspective, from the company's perspective, to be able to track that and to see how it really helps people and measure. What I do with several companies that are starting these processes these days, we always start with a pilot project. So we say, okay, this is conditional. We do it now. Let's see how the people are going to work, how it's going to be, what the obstacles may be on the way, this and that. Then we measure and we decide which direction we go. Maybe we extend the pool when it comes to different countries, this and that. But also, it's also the company's strategy. I remember a few years ago, before we even spoke about working from anywhere, remote work, that was not the case. I think it was 2017. I worked with a European e-commerce company, and that was a gaming company as well. And they had people, so they were looking for customer support for South Korea, obviously. So, but the idea was they were in Europe. So instead of thinking, we'll hire these people remotely as customer support to work from South Korea to service people in Korea and in that time zone, they didn't even think about it. They're like, oh, we will relocate 30 people from South Korea to Europe with their families to work in Europe at night to respond to customers' queries. And so I was like, what are you doing here? And that was obviously complete nonsense. So the rotation was crazy. It's a different culture. People wanted to relocate with their families, work permits, this and that. So it's also your business strategy to look what really adds value for you, where the people are, and also what you have to lose. Because what I see clearly, I also support companies with their global talent strategies. So I kind of automate them, design where to go, which market, and I evaluate the applications and see how the campaigns are working. Most cases, the motivation to change a job is today, I'm looking for a remote job. So if you don't offer it, maybe now it's like, oh, that's not real. But you as a business owner, as a company, you'll start seeing it at least in a few months that you'll be losing the top people because everyone sees what's happening in the world. So those are definitely
so there's some of the point that there's so much in that, Nadia. I'm like mind is just bursting with so many different aspects to dive into there. But maybe I'd like to, Peter, how are you finding it? Like the companies helping them craft these policies, helping them decide, the business case for this or not. How do you do that? How do you approach that when you're going into companies?
Well, I think let's take Spotify as an example because I wouldn't say I would have done it exactly the same way, but I can say probably with many others in the audience here, I was quite surprised when they super early announced their, you can work from anywhere policy. Skeptical also, knowing permanent establishment, the whole shebang.
Of course.
And then they did great though, right? Great timing, that's what they do. And then if you look at the actual policy, well, that could have been crafted by me still working at PwC, for instance, or me doing what I do nowadays, because it's more or less compliant, right? They say you can work from anywhere, and in the small print it says, well, if we have an entity there, and in their business they have a lot of entities all over the world, so that's really helpful. So at least they can offer their employees to permanently work from somewhere else, and that is a very important starting point for this compliance or for a policy around work from anywhere. You really have to start distinguishing between permanently working from somewhere else or from anywhere, or temporary, so let's say dynamic working from anywhere. Totally different things, but I do think that Spotify really nailed it with the policy. I just think the communication was a little bit overdone then, but that's maybe a conservative lawyer speaking.
Yeah, that's fair point. I would say if either of you have really good examples of companies that you feel have a really good policy, I know there's not many that actually haven't published. Feel free to let me know. Likewise, any in the audience as well. If any of you have any examples of other companies that you really admire, you think have really nailed this. I know this is fast moving. This is evolving quite a lot. We have some companies this on our blog post as well that might be interesting. We'll be updating that in due course. But then, Peter, can you tell me more about yourself, your own journey? Let's say into how does somebody in PwC end up in work motion?
Yeah, well, so I've been working in this area of, let's say, a modern work for a while already, like 13 years, or nowadays, almost 14 years. I'm getting old. But I started experiencing myself more or less due to the pandemic, also around the time when we got our little boys. So, and I really loved it. And of course, it was a big trend in the world. For me personally, that's something to do with working at a big corporate, Big Four, for 13 years, and then either like remaining seated on that train, or making the big leap to a startup. Well, Workmotion was back then still a startup. We're now a scale up, right? We grew from the 3 founders to 300 people now in 2 years. So I basically took a chance and thought, yeah, this is the moment to jump on a different train, basically. And there's no greater moment to be in, and that's in HR tech right now. So that's where I made the change. It was a combination of this new situation of work and basically seeing that probably a Big Four corporate is not as well as a startup, or not as good capable as a startup to grasp that change and act upon it so quickly as you need to.
It makes sense. And maybe teasing that out then as well, I'm curious. I mean, it's always tricky, but how do companies choose the right employer of record? I mean, obviously, an employer of record that has a legal entity in a country has a big advantage. Some work through partners. That's an obvious one. But how do companies choose, what is the right one for them?
I think geographic, let's say, connection plays an important role. The very big players have, of course, their core market in the US, and as a result, they also focus on particular types of employment, if you can call it employment, so co-employment or contractors, which, as you know, in Europe is maybe not so relevant, or definitely just not so relevant. So I do think that geographics play an important role. And then I think in the entire process, you have to get a good feeling for it. It's all around trust. Well, not for nothing do we even have a whole department around this here at Workmotion, because you're trusting your usually most important, most valuable asset to this company, your people. So you need to feel good. You need to feel like this party is doing the best they can. And and I think in the compliance world, especially geography is one of the key reasons, or one of the key aspects that
makes sense. I like as well, Nadia, just separately, we got also through the through Ivo Svarpar I caught him up with him in Lisbon recently as well. He's in the Remote First Institute. Just a slight side detour. But can you just tell us about the Remote First Institute that's going on at the moment? I'm sure a lot of people would be curious to hear more about that, because that's also something for either borderless companies or even those that are just curious about remote work. It's a nice little resource.
Absolutely. Before I go towards the detour, I just have to add one more thing to what Peter said.
Go for it.
Yeah, about choosing from an operational perspective, because I've worked with companies implementing employers of record again. And it's also the interface, actually, and the integrations also from a user experience, right? To know that you have these people that you as a company, you offer some perks to your employees here, then you have an employer of record. How scalable is it going to be, and how hassle-free for especially people operations and HR to have this good experience for everyone when it comes to scalability and all the, as I've said, integrations and adjustments. So that's probably another thing, but that's just, just something in addition.
That's a good point. No, it's a good point. Very valuable point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, now about the Remote First Institute. Yes, I believe that this is a very exciting engagement also for myself. So feel free to check everyone who's watching the Remote First Institute. So there's a big mission. The mission behind the Remote First Institute is obviously to, well, I would probably fight is a strong word, but I think that's the case. The go back to the office, approach, and to show that work is not a place. And how do we do this? With different research, with different data, with all the top remote experts, not necessarily talking about myself here, but I'm talking about all other founding members, and not only members of the Institute, and also other companies that can be a great benchmark for companies that are willing to have this approach in their own businesses. Why? Because the knowledge is scattered all around the world. There are different resources. Not sometimes, every day I see different people on LinkedIn, different social media, telling everyone what to do and how to do it. So what we're willing to do with the Remote First Institute is really gather the top market knowledge that you can possibly have, and treat it as an inspiration for your business case. Have it supported by data, have it supported when it comes to all the experts, and basically show what value it adds, and that this is the future. and how it affects your personal business case. So don't just go and look for knowledge wherever, finding whatever. Not saying that, that's a bad approach, but it facilitates the process to get to the right resources that you can later on treat as custom made for your company.
Speaking of resources, obviously you're one of them yourself on that legal side. So, I mean, your own journey from WorkMiner, you are living this yourself. But I'm also conscious that, you have a strong legal background as well. Can you tell us more about some of those legal components, of WorkMiner and making it happen, Borderless companies, some of the challenges and the blockers, as well as some of the possibilities?
So I think we will talk a lot. We have two perspectives. I wanted to say we'll talk a lot about all the possible blockers, working from anywhere, this and that. Yes. So, but let me tell you this: we have two perspectives. One perspective is the company and how to mitigate the risk for the company and decrease it as much as possible. You can never decrease it by 100%. Even for one certain reason, that there is always the people factor, and you can't predict what's going to happen. So that's always unpredictable. But again, so here we look at all the challenges, what we can do to mitigate the risk. But also there is another perspective. And the perspective is the people, the contractors, the employees. So what I see when it comes to challenges, even now working with companies, for example, in the US that are hiring people in South America, and now I'm supporting a big project like this, there is no awareness. So I think it's not just for companies to spread this awareness, how to hire people, how to make it work, how to be borderless, but also to explain to individuals what it really means. Because I have, for example, a recruiter who collects all the financial expectations and availability, and people are like, yeah, I want to be a contractor. I'm like, okay, so you're setting up the process. So you will be invoicing us. What do you mean, Nadia, with invoicing? I'm like, well, you said that you will be a contractor. No, I'm just getting paid. And I'm like, okay, where are you? Where now I'm, in Brazil, but actually I want to live in elsewhere. I'm like, but I just have to inform you that it's not going to be possible if you're hired based on an employment contract through our employer of record. Why? So there is this lack of understanding what you need to do, what the difference is between an employment contract, what your obligations are, the taxes that you have to pay when you're an independent contractor, how to make it work, how you can move around. Also, not to forget IT security, which is another big challenge and kind of touches on that as well. That, I also work on this aspect a lot. I'm not a 100% expert. I always work with internal teams on it. But, when you give someone the laptop who's a contractor, there's a huge data leakage. Like, what's the responsibility of that person?
Of course.
Capture it all. And the people, they don't even know. So whenever they receive a contract, in the end, when we already know, I always explain what it looks like. Yes, this and that solution. They're like, okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? And there are also so many questions when it comes to regular payments.
Well, speaking of one of the ones I wanted to dive into on that from both of you here is one of the ones that comes up quite frequently is contractor misclassification. That, for example, the local labor law or tax authorities will see through a contract that really is essentially employee-employer relationship. Can you talk to us more about that? We've got, for example, IR35 in the UK. There's a lot of scare tactics, for example, about that. It is definitely a risk. But for example, if you're employing somebody as a contractor in a different country, what are the factors that will really trigger that being a big risk or not? I mean, obviously, the nature of the work they're doing and the nature of the relationship. But can you tease us out a bit more as to what are the factors that are really going to move that up or down the scale in terms of risk? Feel free, either of you, to come into that, Nadia or Peter.
Peter is first. I'm going to add to it.
Go for Peter.
Sure thing. Well, most importantly, you said, John, what if you're employing a contractor? You need to get your wording right. If you're going for this,
correct.
You're not employing anyone. So that's the mindset thing, right?
That's a good one. I love that.
Never forget about it.
Well said. Absolutely. If you're engaging a contractor, 100%.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's a big problem, but in fact, the factors that are relevant are not rocket science. The thing is, contractors really like to be a contractor, but they of course also like the security of a job. So what are factors that are most relevant? Well, are you an entrepreneur? Do you depend solely on one client? Maybe your employer, right? Where do you have the most of your income? Do you have other clients? Did you work as an employee for that company before? Do you actually have a risk? For instance, we see a lot of contractors that basically have contracting contracts for 40 hours per week. Well, yeah, good luck, right? That doesn't sound like a contractor. And if something doesn't sound like a contractor, from a tax perspective, it's probably not a contractor. So those are the key factors.
But then even to say, looking at this from the risk of a company, if they have sales in a country, obviously I'm guessing that's going to increase the risk or not. Or, obviously the detection risk you've got from the authorities, for example, that if they're very, very big on legislation and they're checking quite regularly, if they're linked with immigration, I'm presuming there's a bunch of other factors like that. Or what do you advise for companies that are trying to deal with this?
Nadia, you want to take this one?
Yeah.
Sorry, what I was actually looking, I was about to present you like a full list because I just finished the project.
Oh yeah, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
So yeah, because I work with one company that they have contractors all around the world and they didn't use an employer of record. And they said, okay, Nadia, what can we do to make it extremely tight to eliminate the risk as much as possible? Can you please outline the risks? And I just opened it here. So what should and what should not be included in a contractor agreement? So in general, what I've been doing is I've evaluated the toughest of cases. And it's not always a one size fits all because we have different jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, there's even no law, for example. I know that in some Asian countries, it's this way that they don't go after it yet, but in others they do. And the gig economy has really created this movement to go after misclassification very much because companies are willing to save money.
Uber and whatnot. Yeah.
Exactly. But what do I have? What I have recommended, that's my recommendation to them, what you should never include in a contractor agreement. Not to forget, it's not just the agreement, but it's actually also
the nature of the work. Yeah.
The nature of the work, how you then perform the services. Yeah. Position, job title, fixed monthly payments, for example. You shouldn't really do that. Perks and benefits, paid holidays, medical insurance, business equipment, pension plans, a service location. You can't tell them where to work. Come to this office. We're talking about a Borderless company, but anyway, performance measuring, right? Performance tracking. In the same way you treat your employees. A non-competition clause. If you exclude the right to subcontract, that would show that the nature is quite personal, which we want to avoid. An exclusivity clause, daily working hours, delegation details when it comes to your supervisor. Who is your supervisor? That your role is crucial in the company structure. The manner of providing services, I can't tell you how to do it because you're my business partner in the end. Also the right to act in the client's name, which also leads then to permanent establishment risks. That's the story then, and a probationary period in general. So that was the kind of, but there's
somebody came prepared. I like it. Great advice. No, great advice. Great advice, Nadia. And then Peter, can you tell me more about WorkMotion and WorkFlex? I have to say, great tool. What's wonderful about this space is for hire work from anywhere. There's a bunch of different solutions that will work for different companies. And can you tell us more about WorkFlex?
Yes. Yeah, that's a really cool solution. So I said at the beginning, right, we're mainly an EOR, but there's a little bit more to what WorkMotion does, and WorkFlex is a great example. So EOR is permanently working from abroad, and as I already said, you need to very clearly differentiate from a compliance perspective, temporary working from somewhere else across borders. Temporary, let's say for now, it's definitely no longer than 183 days in a year. And what WorkFlex does is that we help companies to offer temporary work from abroad or workations or whatever you would like to call them as a benefit in a compliant manner. So it's an end-to-end solution where the employee puts in a request to work from anywhere. Then WorkFlex provides a risk assessment covering all of the most important compliance topics. It's basically 5, right? PE, payroll, social security, labor law, and visa immigration. And then if approved by both HR and the employee manager, then WorkFlex also requests for an A1 or an COC, a travel insurance. So basically really providing, offering a benefit without the employer burden that is still a risk, of course, when having people somewhere, working from somewhere else.
How do you find the A1 Social Security as well? That's an interesting one for Europe. To give the audience a bit of background, A1 Social Security forms required in Europe for basically for people spending time in a different jurisdiction where a Social Security agreement is in place, need to get these in place in advance. Like, for example, pre-pandemic, if people were going on business travel for a day, technically you'd have to have an A1 Social Security form, whereas a lot of companies, the burden, the administration burden would be too much. But how are you finding the balancing act between when it makes sense to go for an A1 Social Security form and when not to, Peter? Because obviously trying to manage that administration burden, obviously for people that are staying for a long time or frequent business travelers, makes a lot of sense. How do you identify the high-risk population? Obviously, if they're going to a high-risk destination, like for example Austria, but how are you like figuring out when does it make sense to apply for the A1 form, when not?
So we're a technology firm, so I think it makes sense requesting it always, anytime, because it should not be an administrative burden. It should be a click of a button. We've got that in place for a couple of countries now, but of course, it's some countries it is terrible. And what you see with most large corporates that I used to work with also at PwC, they usually take a threshold of like 5 working days or so, right? That's super common in the market, and then they will request an A1. And still, in most countries, France is an exception, for instance, A1s and CRCs are really nice to have, not needs to have, and you could even theoretically request for them after the trip. But as I said, I think, it's 2022. This should be automated, and it is not rocket science. We've done it for a couple of countries, and that makes it so easy to just make sure it's in place always. And then it's a really nice and comforting thing to bring along, basically.
And actually, we had a discussion on this recently at LinkedIn as well, I think, Peter, where I think both in Europe and in the US, but particularly in Europe, they're looking at putting together legislation or some guidance that basically we give up to, I think, a 96-day threshold for remote workers. Because it's at the moment, the way the tax and employment legislation is designed, you look at A1s, posted workers, you look at all the different aspects that's required. It's not built to facilitate high volumes of remote workers just spending a little bit of time in different countries, is it? Peter.
Absolutely. So the regulatory framework, I've written a blog about it a while ago. It's a rusty regulatory framework, and that is kind of okay, right? It was never written for the situation that we are in right now. And that is fine to a certain extent. So we have to accept it and basically work our way through. That's all right. Of course, what's a little bit annoying is that you see very little movement. And the topic you just mentioned with this recommendation paper for 96 days or whatever the number is, it only covers a specific type of taxation, like personal income tax. So it's not really a permanent establishment topic, which is super relevant still. And I think more importantly, we've seen very little progress on a European level on the legislation anyway. So I'm just not seeing anything happening with this piece of advice. It'll take probably 5 to 10 years before it's even implemented. And that's simply too long. Yeah,
well, then kind of projecting forward then, Nadia, like where, the future of, basically national laws and sovereign countries and taxation, where does this end up? How quickly will it take? And it's an open question, it's a difficult question. How quickly will it take for, different countries to speed up? Some of them are being very fast out of the mark with things like, for example, digital visas. We'll have a separate discussion on that, but some are much slower behind in adapting to this. How do you see that ending up, Nadia?
Well, I think the biggest issue that we are running into and we will be running into is scalability. So I would say that I hope, at least now, for example, we have one directive, for example, in the EU, which is the work-life balance one. And based on that, at least, and I'm not talking about global mobility, but I'm talking about the right to work remotely, even as a right. This is included in that one. And that's supposed to be then taken on to all EU member states as well, which is the reason why I see changes in local laws. Obviously, the deadline was the end of August this year. It's September, and in many countries, we don't see the end, right? It's not happened yet. But I think that the issue is that also in most countries, there is no such thing as remote working by law. And I'm not talking... That's the case. We still have teleworking, right? Which could possibly be very similar, but still not that kind of flexible as remote working. So I would look at that first. And I also had a really interesting conversation last week with also an employment lawyer in Poland, actually. And I think that generally because now in Poland, there will be a new law implemented very soon, including remote working based on that directive, who has the right, why, if you're a caregiver, a parent, this and that, whatever. So long story short, but they don't really see the need as a country yet to go that far. So it's a movement. I feel like we the three of us and our dear audience here, we are a bit in an echo chamber, because that's the issue, because they don't go that far. They're like, okay, but that's happening. Yes, because if you want to take care of someone that's necessary, you can work from home. But I'm like, what about, and the horizons in general, even when we look at governments, that is quite slow. So there will be some, I think when we also look at some popular holiday destinations, even in the EU, they see it as something that's going to help the economy. And that's definitely, you know, it's becoming a priority. Whereas in other countries, it's a very long process.
Yeah.
And that's, as Peter said, it will take years.
Yeah, no, you're right. We spoke of this a year ago, and you had basically the vice prime minister of Taoiseach of Ireland, Leo Varadkar. He was talking about how, you know, in Ireland they've reasonably high marginal tax rates, and, you know, probably in the top 20 in the world, and this is a challenge for them. So the model is changing of countries that, you know, in the 90s they used corporation tax to attract, you know, companies to those countries, and the employees would follow, obviously, once you got the companies. Whereas now, obviously, with remote work, it's challenging that a little bit. Like, you know, right now, if somebody can just as easily work at home and in Spain, they might well just do it. It'd be cheaper, for example, easier to get accommodation, or it could be some countries, it could be where they might have a lower income tax or whatnot. So I think it is challenging that it will take a while for it to see how that plays out. I would like to ask you as well, come back to one of the early questions. Do you have any examples of companies that are doing a really good job in this, from either work or hire, from anywhere that you really admire? Any, Peter, that jump out for you, or for you, Nadia?
I think, well, yes and no. I think that every, let's say, fully remote company nowadays, well, WorkMotion is one itself, but you also have most of the other EORs, and of course GitLab, etc.
Yeah.
And more or less any other company that is basically going for it. And what was it earlier this week? This massive company that announced you don't have to come back into the office. That's of course not work from anywhere, but
that was Amazon. I think it was
Amazon. There you go.
Yeah.
I think any company that pushes towards that, I deeply respect, because it's quite challenging, and especially if you're like internationally working from anywhere. So I think every company who dares to do this and communicates it publicly, even, I think is very brave and doing a good thing. They're going into the direction that I think we're all going to go anyway. And what they do in their quest, or in basically by pushing for this, is they'll also let authorities know and basically make the urge for adjustments bigger, because, and that's the no part of the answer, I'm not entirely sure how all of these fully remote companies manage their compliance position. Of course, payroll, social security, labor law, that's kind of doable. But I'm especially talking corporate income tax, which I think is honestly is almost impossible to be fully compliant. So that's the no part. But what they do by simply pushing for it is just trying to get that rusty regulatory framework to be updated. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I think the OECD has been like scaringly silent already for, what is it, almost 18 months now since their latest PE tax policy update. And I think what they do is by pushing for progress here, is letting all of these authorities, including the OECD, know there's need for an update here. Come on.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm seeing a very, very good question that's come up since then, and I'm going to ask it to you in a sec. But I mean, I do believe you're right. The broadening out of permanent establishment risk and definition across the board in a lot of different countries is just clashing right now at the moment with the risks that can be triggered, in this case, remote work. Very good question here from Mark Helliker. Individual states put the integrity of their market and the rights of their nationals first. Therefore, do you think the incentive to support remote working is a personal and corporate one, rather than in the interests of governance? And maybe to tie in with this, Mark, just something to throw in there. Some of the, for example, digital nomad visas are a good place to start. But in the case of Barbados, the welcome stamp, since they've introduced it, has generated $100 million of income for Barbados since they launched it, which is, it's not quite the size of the cruise market was for them pre-pandemic, but it's not far off in the space of, that was during the space of a year. So I think for some countries it definitely will be. But I'd like to get your take on that, Nadia and Peter. What do you think about that question? What would you say the incentive on where do governments, how would they look at this? How would they see this from that perspective, the question that Mark had?
So that's a very complex question, and an even complex response would be required. I will start probably with the biggest challenge, which is, and I'm not willing to be rude or anything here, but I am not entirely sure that all governments have started evaluating this topic as a challenge or benefit. I don't think the thinking has gone that far. In most destinations, it's rather than just responsive, rather than being proactive. That's what I think is happening right now. But I would look at it from a bit of a different perspective, because we may say, okay, you give someone the right to work remotely, work from another country, okay, how that boosts another economy. And as you've just said, that we may be losing that person. But that works both ways. It also gives countries the opportunity to hire people from other destinations to help them grow their local economy.
Good point.
So that's also another story. And also, when I look at it, that we are really becoming a global village, it's all an exchange of services and where it adds value. So I think definitely governments should take a look at it, and it shouldn't be just a situation of, okay, if we allow you to leave the country, you will contribute to someone else's whatever situation. But no, let's think about it, how we can also facilitate the process to make our country attractive for those that would like to be here, especially when we talk about the situation also in the EU, that in many cases, it's not that accessible from people from the outside. Look at the United States, for goodness sake. That's just a great example. Like, it's almost completely closed. There would be so many individuals willing to contribute to their economy if only given a chance to even get an employment contract. But no, this visa sponsorship, the process, this and that, this is just a big problem. So I believe that it definitely should be addressed. But again, my perspective is that, as I've said initially, we're in a bit of an echo chamber. We can kind of do a simple SWOT analysis here, but I don't think the world is ready to be able to really value the possibilities. It will happen with time, but it needs more triggers than just the pandemic for the governments to realize that,
No, I 100%. I think from what we're seeing, there's pros and cons to this that we've all, got to be open and honest about. If I look at it from other guests that have been on who have helped put together digital visas in different countries, one of the challenges you have is that if you're putting digital visas together, you need a whole of government approach. And some countries it was just the tourism authorities, they didn't do it right, and it really failed miserably. Some others did a good job, and it worked very, very well. But I think one of the big challenges, one of the opportunities, is to get all this talent of remote workers, and hopefully there'll be a spillover effect of talent in with the local people, local economy and whatnot, even from just a spending perspective. But one of the challenges is obviously, looking at gentrification of remote workers coming into places that are already popular. Look at, for example, Canggu in Bali, for example, the prices have skyrocketed of places to rent there. And then if you manage it the wrong way, all of a sudden you can push people out of the locals, and that's a very, very it's a very, very tricky one to try and manage. So trying to have a balanced approach where you'll have a bit of regional development. I can see, for example, Gonzalo Hall is doing some great work, for example, in Brazil. He's obviously done the community building in Madeira, for example. But it'd be interesting to see how these kind of remote work communities build out and how governments approach that from that perspective. But another question I have for you, Peter, I was curious of, was the countries. What countries are you seeing are the ones to really watch out for, from either a permanent establishment or contract classification, or from whatever perspective, from the risk perspective? I mean, it's obviously broader than just tax and employment law. There's data privacy and security and many others as well. But what are the main countries on the tax and employment law side that you're seeing that are the ones to really watch out for, that are kind of causing friction, let's say, or ones that can be high risk?
Yeah, good question. And it relates to the question that Mark asked. Thanks for that, Mark. It was a really good one. I'm pretty clear on this, right? I think any government measure that we've seen so far since the pandemic, no question about it, it was their market first. And 3 examples. The first one indeed are these digital nomads. The other ones are you seeing more around like in the Mediterranean countries, Portugal, Spain, Italy, who seem to see the opportunity of remote work, and although not in writing so far, seem to be even pretty relaxed when it comes to PE risk, etc. And maybe Spain will even loosen its very tough labor law regulations a little bit. So they see the opportunity of like Western European workers basically moving as a nomad to their country. So they're not countries to watch out for, they're actually countries to move into. Then for the last one, a couple of countries where you should watch out because they've also taken measures, and I'm not blaming them, but I think the best example would be India, who has always been very, very strict on PE. And I'm not seeing a change there. On the contrary, I see them becoming even stricter in their policy about like remote workers establishing a PE there. And it's for a totally fair reason, right? Because, you know, to put it super openly, right, what have the Western countries done to Africa, or what would we do to other regions? I'm not proud of it, right? But we would suck all the value out of it and leave them with, well, more or less nothing. And India is just not going to let it happen. And they're saying, we've got a lot of people, a lot of bright people, great programs, etc., who can do Western European jobs remotely from India, totally fine. But we want a little piece of the pie. And I cannot really blame them, but that's making especially the PE discussion there very difficult.
Yeah, I know India comes up again and again and again. And also as well, like China from a data privacy security, that can be tricky, and from what else as well. But what about you, Nadia? Are there any countries in particular that are, that are keeping you awake at night when you're dealing with?
Yeah, several. I have a really long document with a really long list, but I'm going to read it here because you would be. No, but I think the most misclassification maybe cases that I've seen: Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, the UK, the United States. So those are the ones that France, interestingly, I've seen as well. I had a client who he just shared the story that it happened a year ago. They said during the pandemic, you can work from anywhere. So the employees were so happy to move to Romania and stay there permanently for a French salary. Very convenient, right? To live in Romania in the countryside for a Parisian salary, which was, VP and that kind of stuff, those kind of roles. And that person not only got caught for misclassification, but also for tax residency, because they were willing to buy a house in the countryside and they had to report the income and everything to get a loan, to get a mortgage. So they shared the whole process from a personal perspective. But what I think is also really crucial, because all the time when we even talk about misclassification, we talk about it from the employer's perspective. But the point is that it doesn't just raise, not only in the countries that I've mentioned, because it can happen in many, many, many countries. And I think it's coming. And it's even when I look at South America and the movements and all the laws that are being implemented there, it's a result also what we've briefly touched on, the gig economy and making this really better for everyone. So it's also to be able to explain the contractors that it's not like it's just a risk for a potential employer, so your client. But if you get misclassified, you will be in serious trouble as well. So this awareness is lacking here, to be able to explain to the people that, okay, we'll have a terrible problem, but you will have also a very big problem from your individual standpoint. And this is not that clear to everyone,
Well, yeah, and there's a very, very good question on that coming from Simon Gray. I see Brent has another good question as well. But if we look at Simon's question, he says, are there any case studies you can point to where a company was deemed to have created a permanent establishment through the use of contractors supporting clients, like no generating local revenue in employers' countries? So essentially, agency permanent establishment. Are there case studies that you guys can point to that can talk about this, for example, to can illustrate this particular risk?
Well, I don't think that I understand the question fully, because it's about having a contract.
So when you have a contractor,
country, right? It would definitely be the contractor's country. I think that's
correct. Correct.
So we're talking about a situation where, let's say, company XYZ from country A has a contractor in country B working for, obviously, this company, and then constituting potentially a PE.
Like exactly. So a French company hiring a contractor in the UK, for example, and they're doing, sales generating activities, for example, in a senior role, and they help generate permanent establishment for that company. I mean, for a lot of these cases, they're negotiated with the tax authorities. The fines are very often not disclosed, or big cases made of. There are publicly available permanent establishment fines, all right, for the big ones. But for this case, for something like this, Peter, would you know of any case studies to highlight?
So I think there's a pretty famous case for Bosch in Italy. Although I'm not entirely certain whether it was a contractor or not, but you can find something about it online. It just wasn't good for the brand. But there are hardly case studies, thank God, like this, because the question actually says not generating local revenue. And in that case, I don't think the authorities will have a great story for this PE, because you're not an employee if you're truly a contractor, and you're not generating local revenue. Assuming you're not in an office of this company, which would be a little bit weird in this case, in this setup, I don't think there's a good story for the authorities. Of course, the problem is what Nadia just said, right? If we all think that this is a contractor and all of a sudden, this contractor doesn't seem to have any other clients, so there's a misclassification, then already you're unhappy because, hey, there's an employee case, and then the authorities are on it, right? And think, hey, but if you're an employee, you've been working here for a while, you may not have been generating local revenue like a dependent agent, but still you've created a fixed place of business in your home office maybe. And then as really hits the fan, right? And things get super expensive. So yeah, it can trigger a whole lot of domino effects there.
It's a good point. I mean, the case that I've heard as well is you can have during COVID. There was one case where it was a tech company that had people employed in the south of Europe. But they weren't actually employed. They were actually engaged as contractors. And essentially, when they basically got COVID, were in hospital for a couple of months and sued the company successfully for a contractor misclassification, for example. But again, that's a contractor misclassification example there too. But it's a good question. There's another one as well. I'm sorry, feel free to jump in there, Nadia.
Yeah, no, I maybe have a very complicated case that I can just point to responding to that question. So you, John, you've been involved in that as well, actually. We spoke about it a couple of months ago. So I had a client in the e-commerce business with an entity in the States hiring a contractor in Canada. The issue was that this e-commerce business now ships to Canada as well. And also, so they are kind of really engaged in exploring that market. That person is a contractor in Canada, conducting marketing activities on the Canadian market to create leads, which still hasn't really generated that much profit because the US market was the first one, and it's still going to be the main one. And when I saw, because I support them also in not only in employment, but also in hiring contractors as well, I said, well, this is the first red flag that I see here immediately. Like, we really need to tackle this, because this person not only represents you everywhere in front of all local authorities, they work for the US business, but still some portion of their marketing activities touches on that market, and that does generate revenue, and they are there and they're doing it. So let's take a look at it. So I think those are really tricky situations, what we can do to even create awareness, because companies, and I told them this, and they were like, oh, we haven't even thought about it, like, well, luckily I did, because that could really raise big issues in the future. But that's just one case that I
valid point. There's another interesting angle. There's a Brent, he was mentioning about who works from anywhere, when you're hiring somebody from a different country, about their education and how valid it is from jurisdiction. So I presume there'll be some tools that will emerge to be able to kind of validate some of the stuff. It's hard to validate, the education experience, but I'm sure there's background tech tools there. If there's any ones you can recommend, feel free to let Brent know on that one. I'm just conscious of time then as well. Two last very quick questions. The first one is a very quick one. I mean, heading into a recession now, do you think most companies will pull back on work from anywhere or not? Do you think this will be reduces employee benefit, or will they continue to hire from anywhere or work from anywhere? Both of those. What's your take on that, Peter? Do you think they'll be pulled back or stay at the same level or increase?
I think that would be the most stupid measure they could ever take. Well, maybe it is an advantage if you want to basically have your people resign on their own. Then it's a good measure to call them back into the office. Otherwise, no. And why is that? I think all the statistics, and there are thousands of them available online on flexibility, show that during the pandemic, this has basically come up as the second most important benefit there is for employees. So the first one will probably always remain remuneration. Work is not a charity, totally fine. But employee benefit number 2 is now flexibility. There's a key difference between the two, remuneration and flexibility, and that is flexibility is for free. So in a time of recession, why would you take away the cheapest benefit that you can get? I wouldn't understand.
Good point. And I suppose, Nadia, I know we're all in a bit of an echo chamber, but genuinely, what do you think? What would you say? I mean, I put the other side of it. The other side of the coin is that, it's expensive to administer, it costs money to allow people, they're hiring in jurisdictions, all these different risks we could worry about. What's your thought? You think companies will pull back or keep going? I know I agree with Peter's first point, but I'm conscious of putting out the other side of it as well.
Yeah. Peter, I love that you said that it's the cheapest benefit, because it really is. Honestly, it really is. When I look from the internal perspective of a company at all the operations costs, all the HR benefits, all the well-being budgets, training, everything, when we are heading into recession, those are the things that are being cut because they're horribly expensive. But today, even for a short-term basis, if you invest your money once as a company to make this a business solution for your people, at least for the next year or so, even as a short-term working, not permanent, but even short-term working abroad policy, looking at the situation when, this is a really unstable time for all of us. We don't know what's going to happen in the winter, right? So we are in Europe. Even for people to be able to say, I really need, for my mental health, to be able to deliver, to be able to be productive, to go to a warmer destination, you as an employer, you just give them the whole framework and they navigate it themselves. I don't see, to me, it's also the cheapest benefit that there exists. I mean, I'd rather cut on, mandatory office attendance with a lunch box, that was offered. I read it somewhere online yesterday. Someone, I think, it was the New York Times. Yes, it was the New York Times that said that we were offering lunch boxes if you come to the office. Like, come on, cut this. And just let your people work anywhere. Like, that's just going to be so much cheaper and more beneficial.
That's a good point. No, like you said, it makes a ton of sense. I mean, very helpful, having that in mind for, again, looking at the business benefit of all this and building that in. But I guess last question we always ask our guests. I'd like to ask both of you. Maybe Peter, you start off. You can work anywhere in the world. Where is it going to be and why?
I can already work anywhere in the world. So usually I live in Amsterdam, and I usually work from there. I'm now in Berlin, where we have still an office. And so I would go for Amsterdam. But the core reason is that, Amsterdam is very nice, of course, but it's also very expensive, and there's way too high taxes also in the Netherlands. But there's a key benefit, and that's basically that we've got grandparents in the Netherlands, and we've got also 2 young sons, 1 and 3-year-old. So really thankful that the grandparents take care of them every now and then, and that they, like, the boys grow up to knowing our parents very well. That's, I think, a key benefit there. So, and when they grow up and when they grow a little older, I don't know. Well, the Netherlands is a good place.
Yeah, I like it. Good one. And how about you, Nadia? For you, you can work anywhere in the world. Where's it going to be and why?
From a tax and legal perspective, I keep my residence in one place, but all the rest. So I travel a lot, and I shared it recently on LinkedIn as a big problem. And someone said, Nadia, it's not a problem, but it kind of is. Whenever I go to a new destination, and I do this every few weeks, I am so positively amazed, because I always get ready. I always prepare myself on how to work, what to do, where to go, what to see, whom to meet, this and that. And also because of, being everywhere online, I really know so many people. So whenever I come back home for another week or 2 before I take off somewhere else, I think like, wow, it's been so amazing. I'd like to go back. Then I go to a different destination. Wow, it's been so amazing. I'd like to go back. And then over and over and over and over again. So I cannot tell you, but a brief response, I'd love to be anywhere and everywhere at the same time.
What a great way to finish it off. Listen, Peter and Nadia, thank you so much. A really insightful discussion. Really enjoyed it. Thanks very much for taking the time to catch up. Thanks to all our audience as well for being there as well. Really appreciate all the questions, and see you the next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.